Okay, class, we're back. Part two of the historical context of Israel. It's troubled. Why? Well, you read about this revolt, Maccabean revolt in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, as well as in ancient historical sources such as Josephus. This period leading up to the Herod the Great can be called Israel's troubled past. We see this period overlaps the Roman period, in which Rome will be actively involved in affairs and governance of Palestine. So let's take off the Maccabean period to the birth of Christ. We look at this verse here in Matthew, and notice how it ends regarding the birth of Jesus. And when Herod the king heard it, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. So we're going to investigate this. Who's Herod? Why was he troubled, and all Jerusalem with him? You have to understand their background, their history. In this lecture, which is the longest lecture, by the way, we will try to look at some of the historical precedents for the different sects we see in the New Testament, for some of the regions and why they play into the politics in the days of Jesus, like the Decapolis, like Idumea. And who was Herod? He was an Idumean. How did that happen? That he was a Jew or half Jew. So a lot of things of interest. So a lot of facts during this lecture. We need to understand that this Maccabean revolt in 168 to 143 technically included the Hasmoneans, who ruled Palestine until the Roman general Pompey's conquest in 63 BC. But we need to understand who are these Maccabeans and what was this revolt all about. Why they revolted against the Seleucids, we've already hinted at, is because of their forced Hellenization policy. In fact, the Seleucids took the Hellenization agenda of Alexander the Great seriously to unite the world. Antiochus IV attempted to annex Egypt. It failed because Rome intervened. The Roman Empire was expanding. It didn't want its main source of grain taken over by the Seleucids, nor did the Seleucid Empire to increase in strength. Outside of Alexandria, therefore, an envoy of the Roman Senate, Pompilius Linus, you can read about him in Encountering New Testament Backgrounds by Ferguson. He drew a circle around the ground around Antiochus when he was there in Egypt, and said, before you step out of this circle, you've got to promise you're going to take your troops and leave Egypt. Well, Antiochus IV knew the power of Rome. He spent 12 years as a hostage in Rome, so he acquiesced. This was also because of what was happening. Just a few days before this, Rome had defeated Macedonia in a battle of Pagna. So within a week, Rome had defeated Macedonia, taken Egypt under its protection, and is now forcing Syria to submit to its wishes. Obviously, a new power is now in the area. So this diplomatic defeat caused false rumors to reach Jason, the high priest, that Antiochus had been killed. Well, that's a false rumor, but Jason was in Transjordan because he was replaced as high priest by Antiochus, by his brother Menelaus. Now, what Jason did was he took his supporters to Jerusalem and seized control of Jerusalem. Wow. So Antiochus, because of this sting of the diplomatic defeat already, and now this little revolt going on, boy, it ticked him off, to say the least. So he sent his generals into Jerusalem. He ransacked the temple and slaughtered Jerusalemites. 22,000 soldiers did this. He also sent them in there to enforce paganism, that is, to outlaw Judaism, to consolidate his kingdom. So Antiochus IV in 168 BC, that's an important date, issues a decree prohibiting the practice of Jewish religion. The scriptures were to be destroyed, and many manuscripts were destroyed. The Sabbath, the festivals, no longer observed. Food laws abolished. Circumcision not practiced. A smaller altar also was erected on top of the great altar in the temple. This was a supreme insult because it's on this small altar. There was a processional honoring the god Dionysus, or Bacchus, the Greek god of wine, and a swine was slaughtered on that altar in honor of that festival. Now, these pagan practices became compulsory, as did the processional marching in honor of Dionysus. So this, in addition to that, altar to the Syrian high god, identified as Zeus, was erected in the temple. And prostitution was practiced right in the temple precincts. So all of these things forced down the throats of the Jewish people. So there was justification for the Jews making a pun on his title. He was called Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanes is a Greek word that means God manifest. But they referred to him as Epimanes, that is the madman. So what was the last straw? Well, that was in Jerusalem. Out in the rural districts, it didn't seem to affect them keeping Jewish practices and so forth, but Jewish resistance came quickly. In the village of Modim, also pronounced Modin, it's also spelt both ways, as it's also, so a royal agent of Antiochus urged an elderly priest named Mattathias to set an example by offering a pagan sacrifice. But Mattathias refused. Another Jew stepped forward to comply, but Mattathias killed the royal agent, demolished the altar, fled to the mountains with his 5 sons, and all his sympathizers came to them, and the Maccabean revolt began in 168 under the leadership of the Mattathias family. It's really about 167. We call this family the Hasmoneans after Hasmon, the great-grandfather of Mattathias. And so we need to talk about the Hasmonean boys because it was under Judas, who was nicknamed Maccabeus. It's a Greek that sounds similar to Maccabees, the family name. And Maccabeus means hammer. It's a title given to Judas. There's a lot of play on words here, as you see, as we go through this. So Judas Maccabeus was highly successful in guerrilla warfare until they were able to defeat the Syrians in a pitched battle. Faithful Jews were killed on the Sabbath because they didn't want to violate the Sabbath day. But even as the war got worse and worse, it took on the character of a holy war because even pious Jews, the Hasidim, said, well, we're going to fight on the Sabbath anyway because self-defense is more important in this holy war against this assault against our religion. The Maccabean revolt then triggered a civil war between pro-Hellenistic Jews, like the house of Tobias, and anti-Hellenistic Jews, like Onias and Hasidim. Now, from their strongholds in the wilderness, Judas Maccabeus, his followers, were successful. They raided villages, overthrew pagan altars, killed Jews who were Hellenists, and circumcised children by force. There's a kind of a sad note in 1 Maccabees. The altar of burnt offering that had been defiled the stones were dismantled and placed, quote, in a convenient place on the temple hill, until there shall come a prophet to tell them what to do with them. Sort of an indication that they realized that the prophecy had ceased, and they needed a prophet to arise in order to tell them what to do with this temple altar. But later on, one of the Maccabean boys was attributed by Josephus as having the gift of prophecy. And so 3 years later, on the 25th of Kislev, the third anniversary of the defiling of the altar, the daily burnt offerings was resumed. This cleansing of the temple was a new festival then added to the Jewish religious calendars called Hanukkah, or dedication, Feast of Lights. John 10:22 refers to that. So Judas regained religious freedom, rededicated the temple, conquered Palestine, had the title of Maccabeus, or hammer. You could also translate that Greek word as extinguisher, and I kind of associate it with the idea of terminator. And so after Judas Maccabeus was killed in a battle in 160 BC, his brother Jonathan and then Simon succeeded him in leadership. By playing contestants for the Seleucid throne against each other, Jonathan and Simon gained concessions for the Jews. So Jonathan began to rebuild the temple, damaged walls. Hasmoneans offered many ironies throughout this period. One of the strangest was that the Hasmonean, whose family rose in revolt against Antiochus for his Hellenism, his intervention in religious affairs, began with disposing and appointing high priests. They would accept the high priesthood from one who based his right to bestow it on the claim that he was a son of Antiochus. In other words, they were accepting the high priesthood from a Seleucid guy, because they still saw themselves sort of under their thumb a little bit. Jonathan had neither the military genius of Judas nor the statesmanship of Simon, but he succeeded in playing off the rival claimants of the Syrian throne, and that's how he stayed in power. Now, the next guy, Simon, the brother, gained recognition of Judean independence from Demetrius II, who was a contestant from the Seleucid throne, and renewed a treaty with Rome that Judas had made, proclaimed himself as the great high priest, or was proclaimed by the Seleucids as the great high priest and commander and leader of Jews. So it was Simon who officially united in himself the religious, the military, and the political headship over the Jewish state. In 140 BC, there was an important Jewish assembly, and he was formally proclaimed Simon, commander of the army, ethnarch of the nation, and high priest. Now, ethnarch means ruler of an ethnic people. It had a lot of dignity to that title, a lot of honor to that title. We see this title later used in the New Testament as well. The high priest office was confirmed to his family forever, quote, forever, until a trustworthy prophet should arise, 1 Maccabees 14:41. So here the Hasmonean dynasty established a period of Jewish independence of sorts, a period that was kind of like a renewal golden period, like the Davidic kingdom period. And according to Josephus, this Hasmonean dynasty tells a sad story of internal strife caused by ambition and power. The Hasmoneans themselves, the name Hasmon from the grandfather, right? The Hasmoneans alienated a lot of their supporters, like the religiously minded Hasidim. Now, the Hasidim, meaning holy ones, pious ones, like the Puritans, who split into the Pharisees and the Essenes. The aristocratic, though, the politically minded supporters of the Hasmonean priest kings, became the Sadducees. At first, the Sadducees were the ones in supporting the political base, and they supported John Hyrcanus. Now, the Pharisees were in opposition to this a Hasmonean high priesthood idea. And so, because they weren't really priests, right? And so the Sadducees said, okay, that's all right. Just as long as it gives us political power, we're good with it. Pharisees said, no, it should be a one according to the line of Aaron. So here we have the Sadducees, the dominant party in the Sanhedrin, supporting John Hyrcanus and his group. Now, Aristobulus, the son of John Hyrcanus, was the first in the family to take the title king after the fashion of the Hellenistic monarchs. Again, indicating acceptance of Hellenism, using the same titles and the same desire for power in reaction to Hellenism. So he expanded the Jewish kingdom into the Galilee of the Gentiles. That's what's important to remember about Aristobulus I. In about 100 BC, we have Jewish colonists going into the region of Galilee. And the fact that Joseph of Bethlehem, Joseph the father of Jesus, who is of Bethlehem, now dwelling in Nazareth, is a result of this expansionistic policy of the Hasmoneans, who, in order to secure their new conquest up in Galilee, the Galilee of the Gentiles, settled Jewish colonies in this conquered region. Archaeology bears out this colonization period too. It's fascinating to see how archaeology meshes with all these facts. The next guy, Alexander Jannaeus, had the worst reputation. He had little regard for spiritual aspects of the high priesthood office. There was, in Josephus, one of the Feast of Tabernacles, Alexander was about to offer sacrifice. People threw citrons on him, and so forth. And so it led to a rebellion against him, and he was compelled to put it down with mercenaries. So these rebels against Alexander Jannaeus, kind of a civil war going on again, what did they do? Well, they asked for Seleucid help. King Demetrius III. Irony of ironies. Hasmoneans were supported to throw off Seleucid yoke, and now Seleucids were invited to help throw off Hasmonean yoke. But there was a turning point in the war for Alexander's fortunes. He took gruesome revenge on his opponents, the Pharisees especially, while he caroused with concubines, according to Josephus. 800 men, Jewish men, were hung on crosses as their wives and children were butchered at their feet. Mass crucifixion, killing of women and children, terrifying effect. So that's the kind of thing that was going on now. Now the next ruler, Salome Alexandra, Israel's only queen in the Second Temple period, she totally changed the dynamic here. She appointed her elder son, Hyrcanus II, as high priest. Now he had some claim to some lineage to the high priesthood. So the Pharisees supported him. And the Pharisees came to dominance then in the Sanhedrin under Salome Alexandra. So Aristobulus II, Hyrcanus II, were kind of odds because Aristobulus was kind of on the outs. So what did he do? Well, he aligned himself with the Sadducees. But there was another important player in all this, Antipater, or Antipator, as I've seen some pronounce his name, governor of Idumea. Now remember, Idumea is in the south. It's the Old Testament area of Edom. Antipater was the father of Phasael and Herod, the Herod who became Herod the Great. Now, Antipater saw an opportunity to use this conflict between the boys, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, as a way to bring in, kind of power play here. and he became the real power player in the area. And by the way, Hyrcanus was supported by Aretas III, the king of Nabatean Arabs. Now, Nabatea is kind of in the Decapolis area, the Arabian desert that Paul went out into. You might recognize Aretas III, Aretas IV, his son, was the guy in charge when Paul was converted and went into the Arabian desert. That's the Nabatean desert, ruled by him. So in the end, political rivalry between the Hasmoneans, Aristobolus II and John Hyrcanus, resulted in the Roman general Pompey having to step in and subjugate in 63 BC, important date here. He restored the peace to the region, the Pax Romana kind of idea. We have Pompey trying to enter the Holies in 63 BC. That led to the writing like of the Psalms of Solomon, an apocryphal book, the first Jewish writing to expressly be hostile toward Rome. He expressed an expectation of a righteous Davidic king Messiah who would deliver the Holy Land from unholy enemies. So this became a great expectation during this period. Pompey confirmed Hyrcanus II in the high priesthood, but Pompey made Israel subject to the oversight of the governor of Syria, a Seleucid king. So now the priesthood and the kingship was split. Jews okay for the priesthood, but Seleucid king really is over you. And by the way, the Roman province of Syria exercised oversight over Israel even in the days of Jesus. So we have Herod, king of the Jews, but after him, his sons, we have Pilus, who was the procreator. So procreator of Judea was actually under the Seleucid, under Syrian rulership. So we'll get into that more later. Antipater held the substance of power. Antipater and his sons Phasael and Herod. Now, what happened to Phasael? Well, he was killed in a battle, and so it left only Herod to deal with this. With this. So Pompey, he carried out a lot of slaves also to Rome during this period. They added significantly to the community in Rome. And this is important for understanding the audience of the book of Romans. So there was a large audience of Jews who became believers in the Christos, the Christ, and it caused, we'll look at that more in detail later. Throughout New Testament history, then, Roman power dominated Palestine. So the Herodians, let's talk about them for a few minutes. After Pompey's assassination in 48 BC, Caesar landed in Egypt. So Ptolemy XII blockaded him in Alexandria, the city Alexandria. But timely aid from Antipater again enabled Caesar to defeat that blockade, and he gave favors then to the Idumeans, that is, who also was now part of the Jews, right? So 1 Maccabees 8, Judas tells about how he made an alliance with Rome in view of Roman policy to weaken the Seleucids. He made Antipater, the Idumean, though a Roman citizen. So Pompey, making him a Roman citizen with the title of Procurator of Judea. Now, Procurator is a title in Rome that was basically a finance guy who was in charge of all the taxes and so forth. But he named Hyrcanus ethnarch, ruler of local people. Antipater was poisoned in 43 BC, and then Mark Antony, who came to power, made Herod and Phasael joint tetrarchs, once more terminating Hyrcanus' political authority. The title tetrarch was used in Roman times to denote the ruler of any part of a province and was inferior in dignity to ethnarch. So steps in Antigonus, son of Aristobolus. He gained power in Judea in 40 BC based on the strength of a Parthian invasion in which Phasael was killed. So Phasael, Herod's older brother. For 3 years he held the title of king and high priest, the last Hasmonean, Antigonus, the last Hasmonean to do so. So meanwhile, fleeing Rome because, Fazel was dead and Antigonus came to power. So what does that leave Herod to do, the son of Antipater? Well, he goes and flees to Rome for safety. Well, while there, the Roman Senate in 40 BC declares him to be King of the Jews. Wow, what a political move. But the not so easy task of winning the kingdom was accomplished in 37 BC. Herod persuaded Anthony to put Antigonus, the Lacedaemonian, out of the way. He was bound to a cross, flogged. And according to the Jewish historian, the Roman historian Dio Cassius in chapter 49, he says it was, quote, a punishment no other king had suffered at the hands of the Romans. And then he was killed. So Herod is the client king who was bound to carry out the will of Rome, and he became in full power in 37 BC. Now, he began renovating the temple in 20 BC, and he accomplished that in about 10 years, but they continued to put things onto the temple and making it grander and grander all the time. Because of why? Well, because of people being out of the work. 18,000 people came out of the work because of that. So that was his greatest accomplishment. Now, there's one historical thing we need to talk about on Herod the Great. There was the killing of the babes in Bethlehem, but there's no other secular historian that records this. Not Josephus, not any Roman historian, nothing. Well, why is that? Well, Alfred Edersheim, The Life and Times of Jesus Christ the Messiah, offers an explanation. You can read that there, page 127. And it says it's such a trifling episode among the many deeds of blood as to have seemed not deserving of record on the page of a Jewish historian. So a man who killed a large part of his own family, arrested large numbers of prominent citizens, orders for their execution, and so forth and so on, and orders the death of all the key people in the city at his death. Herod did that so that people would mourn and sort of celebrate his death. So that's the kind of thing that wouldn't have stirred much controversy. Besides that, we will learn, because of the size of Bethlehem at the time, it was probably about 8 to 15 babies that were killed at the time, not just a blimp on the historical record.